I will keep this introduction very brief. I'm Corina Rebegea. I'm a fellow in residence here at CEPA, and I'm joined on the stage by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Rood. Thank you for accepting our invitation. The Minister of Foreign Affairs from Latvia, Mr. Edgars Rinkēvičs. Thank you, sir. And by Professor Alan Riley from the Institute for Statecraft, where he is a senior fellow. Now delve right in. You get applause. So I'll delve right in, and Undersecretary Rood, I might start with you. The new national security strategy and national defense strategy elevate the issue of great power competition with China to the top of America's policy agenda. How does this change impact the way the United States sees Europe? And what would the US like to see its European allies do differently to make our responses more unified?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I see so many old friends and colleagues in the audience, although I must say with the bright lights, I don't see you very well at the moment. But this is a terrific occasion to get together on the 70th anniversary of NATO's founding and the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It reminds us of our common heritage and the serious challenges we overcame. But I do think, as highlighted by this panel talking about China, it highlights the dawn of a new era that we have to attune ourselves to. And so much of the transatlantic dialogue is dominated by a discussion of what we as Americans and Europeans sometimes see as our subtle differences. But if we don't renew ourselves and focus on what unites us, that is our common values, common approach to the world, support for the role of the individual in free societies, free speech, free markets, free movement of ideas, we're going to instead be like a club of people that practice a religion that perhaps is out of date, where we chant again some of the slogans from before without really focusing on what is critical for the future. And I think, as highlighted here, the focus on China is quite appropriate, because I think it's not an exaggeration to say that this is the greatest long-term threat to our way of life and the greatest challenge we face that will dominate really the rest of my career and that of my colleagues in the Pentagon. The National Defense Strategy very clearly lays out a blueprint for America's role in the world and how we see that. And I think it starts with a recognition that in this highly complex, dynamic security environment, the great power competition has returned. And actually, we went through a rather unusual period the past couple of decades without the specter of conflict between the world's largest powers emerging. But regrettably, we're back to that period now, and we really do need to focus on it. So in response to your question, I would say, firstly, a prioritization and a recognition that this type of challenge is upon us, and it's different than that which we faced before. To be sure, there is an ideological competition with, in this case, China promoting an authoritarian model that limits the freedom of its citizens, but with state-directed capitalism. That is to say, capitalism with a very thin and at times permeable layer between the public sector and the role of the state and that of what are nominally independent companies, but companies which take direction from the state. So we have to recognize this challenge, we have to adapt to it, and we don't yet in our societies have a blueprint that we simply need to ask others to follow. So the other thing that I would say we need from our European partners is we need, in this war of ideas and in this competition we're in, we need their intellectual capital. We need the bright ideas that we can preserve the goodness of our societies while screening for Chinese investment. We don't seek a confrontational approach, and we're not destined to be adversaries with China. We want to trade. We want to have interactions. But on the other hand, we want to protect our intellectual property. We want to protect the rules-based international order that we've both worked so hard to create since World War II. And we want respect for the sovereignty of others. We want respect for the role of the individual in society. And so I think a prioritization, a recognition of the challenge, and then the intellectual capital that our partners bring would be the first three things on my list.
Thank you, Undersecretary Rood. I want to get to the other two speakers, but I'll perhaps pose a question now for the conversation later. And you mentioned the various avenues of influence and authoritarianism and the way China is operating across the world. And now we've seen increased presence in the European Union as well. And perhaps I might ask you from a US perspective, where do you see China's ambitions in Europe? How are they manifested? What is their end game? And perhaps what is the desired outcome for us, meaning the transatlantic relationship? Perhaps we can turn to these questions during the conversation. I would like now to perhaps move on to Minister Rinkēvičs. And of course, we've seen, as I mentioned, a lot of Chinese activity in Europe, and China has been investing in strategic projects all over the European continent. And perhaps we might think, that buying a port or a radio station may not be illegal. But if we add up all the investments, as well as other types of actions, this may be an opening for potential malign influence. So what are China's goals, and how do we distinguish malign intent or influence? And what is particularly your country, Latvia, doing to prevent such malign influence and ultimately protect its sovereignty, as Undersecretary Rood mentioned? And not least, what is Latvia doing or should be doing, and what the EU should be doing to better align with the US on this?
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back to CEPA Forum, and thank you very much. If I have to answer all the 5 questions, then I take the whole panel and we are done. So I will try briefly to sketch where we are when it comes to relations with China and what would be the proper response from the perspective of Latvia when it comes to dealing with China on trade and also on security-related issues. Well, first of all, our experience in economic relations and trade with China has been quite interesting and also developing. There is always desire by Latvian business community to do more trade, to do more business, to attract more investment from China, from India, from United States. And I think this is a legitimate interest of any of business community. We had an interesting, let's say, evolution of our relations with China. We were enthusiastically embracing Belt and Road Initiative, and we still are part, and we were the founding members of so-called 16+1, now 17+1 format. We have been discussing a lot about investments in logistics and infrastructure. However, when it comes to the real experience, real life experience, then we are running in some kind of issues that are very critical when it comes to our own security perspective. The first thing, indeed, there is huge interest to attract more Chinese cargo to Latvian ports. However, there is always an issue of the ownership rights in ports. And I think that from our own point of view, we consider our port infrastructure as critical to national security. So that's an issue that we are addressing at national level. Another issue that is more pan-Baltic, but also a European issue, there is a plan to build a high-speed railway from Tallinn via Riga to Vilnius and Warsaw called Rail Baltic. There is a huge interest from our Chinese partners to invest to actually build that railway using some European money, using some Baltic money, and also providing some finances from China, which again is to some extent a very difficult issue from 2 perspectives: European rules and regulations, and also again the critical infrastructure part of it. And of course, 5G issue or investments in information technologies, another experience when you have some companies that have already signed contracts, but now you have growing concerns about security implications. So what would be the possible reaction from an EU member state? The possible reaction from EU member state is very easy. We see that actually we can't deal with some of the security challenges alone, and we need to have European-wide responses. Investment screening is one. Latvia has its own regulations that is national investment screening concerning national security. But then if we look at facts, then for instance, mobile operators are not solely owned by Latvian shareholders. Actually, they are owned by a couple of European shareholders. And even if you apply some Latvian rules in Latvia, they are not working very well in Estonia or in Germany or in Poland. So you need actually to have EU-wide strategy, EU-wide policy. And from my experience, I would say that when it comes to EU, then we have had very good discussion in EU. That doesn't happen very often, but we still had a very good discussion, and we were able to work out some strategy vis-a-vis China on trade, on security, also on human rights, and I think this is some promising news. The only thing that we now need to do is to implement that strategy, because what happens sometimes, even if we agree on good strategy, then we have a couple of EU member states saying that, well, we can do it a bit differently. Another issue that we always are good at the EU level, that national governments are very happy to engage in economic cooperation and do the sexy part of the business and to leave all the blame to EU institutions. For instance, human rights issues, security issues are always left to the Commission to deal with. Not always a very promising sign of unity and solidarity, but I'm quite convinced that this could be a very good way how to actually work out and to implement EU-wide strategy. And the final point, our cooperation in this regard with the United States. I think that one thing that we have almost forgotten, but I think we will be coming back this November at the Foreign Ministers meeting of NATO, is that here in Washington in April, we tasked our experts to work out risk assessment, and that, I think it's the first time when NATO is addressing this issue. Security issues, wider geopolitical issues, but also issues that are related with 5G, with investment in critical infrastructure at NATO level. And I think that the way where we can cooperate with Canada, with the United States, with some other non-EU member states of NATO, and to try to find also the common approach to security issues, to also trade issues, and also to investment to critical infrastructure issues. So that would be my very short response to 5 questions that I would go on and on and on.
I think you did a great job, Minister, addressing the questions, and perhaps just to table this for the discussion, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of solidarity and cohesion at the level of the EU. I think from the very onset of the 16 plus 1 back then format, China's ambition was to create friends within the European Union, and perhaps one question is, has it succeeded? And how do you actually assess the success or the likeliness that the EU will be able to get on the same page when it comes to a strategy regarding China? But that for later. I turn to you, Professor O'Reilly. I guess the same questions when it comes to EU reaction and individual US allies in the EU. But I want to go back to a question that Peter asked in the morning, and I think that sounded like, who will win the future? And that reminded me of a Fortune magazine article that from, I think, July this year, titled, "It's China's World." And this was based on a survey that showed almost parity between Chinese and US companies on the 2019 global Fortune 500 companies. So how do we deal with China in the EU and in the context of the transatlantic relationship?
Okay. Well, where I would start is that, I know there's been gloom and doom, so I'm going to not do gloom and doom. And I'm going to say that where I would start with this very simple observation is that my plan is to write a book in about 10 years' time entitled The Triumph of the West, brackets, despite our best efforts to the contrary, brackets. And the point about it is that the weaknesses of our competitors, and I think Russia is, we've talked about Russia, everyone knows about Russia, I won't talk about Russia. We've talked about China. I think the weaknesses of China, we don't see them, because the problem is because we have our media and we talk about it and we self-flagellate ourselves daily, and you can see the West, warts and all, you don't see the Chinese weaknesses. And the problem is you see this huge economic growth over the last 35 years, and there is a tendency across the world, in Western Europe and Central Europe and Eastern Europe, to see China, opportunities in China as this huge, great carrot. We should look at China as the future. Well, let's take one central Chinese concept, which has been Belt and Road, and the core of that, which is the concept of the Silk Road, the restoration of the Silk Road. This is nonsense. There is a very, very good reason why the Silk Road collapsed. It collapsed because ships got better. Ships got bigger, safer, more reliable. It was on the basis of the quality of the shipping, international high seas shipping from the 1660s onwards, that Lloyd's of London was established in the 1680s. And that is, you can simply move more stuff on the high seas safely and cheaper, and because you've got navigation on high seas without restriction, that you began to see the shift from the Central Asian routes to the sea. And that was true in 1650, and that's true in 2019. Nothing has changed. The concept of the Silk Road is absurd. It is absolute absurdity if you stand back and think about it. The same is true in 1650 as in 2019. It's cheaper to go, and it's easier to go by sea than it is by land. And you can easily see it in another way, even when they talk about rail. Currently, you've got all these trains rattling across Central Asia on the infrastructure built by our Chinese friends. And they take stuff out, but they have nothing to go back. And the Chinese state is subsidizing it to the tune of about $300 million a year. This is not a sustainable business model. So that's one element of all of this. And then I think the next question is, of course, is a prospect of China coming along and paying for infrastructure. But of course, they don't actually pay for infrastructure. It is largely debt funded. And it's not really about the Belt and Road. Put the propaganda to one side. What we're really talking about is the Chinese essentially be willing to offer loans to build infrastructure which will allow them to export more stuff to you. And the point is, for every single state in the Baltic states and Central and Eastern Europe, they have all got trade deficits with China. So essentially, the proposition is this: you can borrow from the Chinese to expand their access to export more stuff to you and increase your indebtedness to China. This is, I suspect, not that great a prospect. And that is then reinforced by another point, and that is anti-dumping, or the dumping, rather, of product into the global markets. Essentially, the problem is that whilst you had the basis for a lot of economic growth from 1990 to about 2008, since then the Chinese state has been pumping cash into the system in order to keep everybody employed and produce more and more stuff. So China now is 50% of flat glass, global flat glass production is Chinese, 50% of steel in the various steel classes, 50% of chemicals in many of the chemical classes, 50% of aluminium, global production. Now, China is not 50% in any shape, manner, or form of the world economy, but it's producing all this stuff. It's able to do it because with fiat currency and complete control of the banks, you can print and print and print. So it's amazing. If you look at the level of Chinese debt, it is now something like almost 300% of GDP, but 2/3 of that was debt that's been created since 2008. This is not a sustainable economy. But what they're doing at the moment is they're dumping products into global markets, and they're stealing everybody's jobs. It drops in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, in the United States, in Western Europe, everywhere. And that's what we're dealing with. And this is not a sustainable business model. And the Chinese are deeply, deeply in trouble. And in the meantime, they're damaging us. They're not a carrot, they're a problem. So what do you do about it? Well, I'll come to that in a moment, but there's one other point I should perhaps make. And that's my Russia-China point. When you're thinking about our friends in China actually buying ports, establishing infrastructure, and so on, given the weakness therein, isn't one of the dangers that at some point, rather like the Roman Empire withdrawing itself from parts of Western Europe, they're going to have to withdraw and sell their assets. And the question is who they're going to sell their assets to. And the nightmare, of course, is that they sell their assets to our friendly Russians as they draw down assets because they've got trouble at home. I think that's one of the issues a little further down the line we'll face. And probably the Russians will be the particular partner of China in drawing down their assets. So what do you do about it? And one of the issues, I think, is anti-dumping duties. The EU has anti-dumping duties. The problem is we impose lower anti-dumping duties than the United States, and we take longer about it. And all this does results in more of the illegal dumped Chinese product to end up in the European markets. The most effective way to protect ourselves is to enhance anti-dumping duties. And the trouble is a lot of member states have, for trying to do various deals with China, have opposed the anti-dumping duties. We all have an interest in really high anti-dumping duties to protect the European economy against illegal trade. The other issue is a foreign investment regime. The EU introduced its own foreign investment screening regulation, which came into force on April the 10th. It comes fully into force in October 2020, but it's now a shadow regime being run by DG Trade in parallel with the CFIUS regime. That can be strengthened. The European Parliament should be fully involved in that. And the other really major issue is that only about 14 member states have actually got foreign investment screening regulations, and they need to have those in place as well. And the other issue, I think, the major issue, is in terms of foreign political influence. We need foreign political influence laws which will apply both in the commercial regime for strategic assets, broader than just investment, and in relation to think tanks, universities, and the media as well, to protect us. And that's, I think, a starting point for a lot of engagement between the EU and US in dealing with China.
Thank you very much. And thank you for mentioning the Belt and Road Initiative. I think we've been hearing quite a bit about it. I think the Chinese, if I may challenge you, the Chinese have caught on to the fact that ships are faster and they've gotten better at stimulating trade. And just as a piece of statistics, the Chinese company Costco now owns stakes in 4 out of Europe's 6 biggest ports, and a few other smaller ones. So it's clear that China's economic and political footprint on the continent is expanding. And perhaps in the discussion, we could go back to the last point you mentioned under the recommendations about what could be done, and that's the political influence laws and what that might mean. I think that's the most challenging one to come around. And I warned the audience we're going to move into Q&A, but before that, I want to go back to Under Secretary Rood and perhaps looking at what China's ambitions are in the EU, and what's our end game here? What does success look for us?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to recognize is the scale of China's ambitions. Now President for life, Xi, I think has remarkable ambitions that China will not only become the world's largest and most influential economy, but also the world's largest and most influential nation in all spheres of life. And China has a very organized plan to do this. as is their way with a state-controlled enterprise, with China 2025 attempting to occupy a dominant position in certain industries, 10 key sectors by 2025, and then 2035 to try to become certainly on a par militarily with that in the West, and then by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, to be the world's preeminent power, what they would call a world-class military. And to give you a sense of the scale of the growth of those ambitions, and it's not just an idea that China wants to compete economically. Frankly, we would welcome that in this country, or that China wants to compete culturally or even ideologically, but it's the way in which China is challenging this international rules-based order, challenging the individual freedoms that we support, challenging the free movement of ideas, people, trade, and promoting an authoritarian model, one that doesn't respect the sovereignty of others. That's what challenges our way of life. And if it was simply an economic competition, we in America rather like competition, and so I wouldn't fear that at all. For example, competing in high-tech sectors is something we're very accustomed to here. We like that very much. We're very proud of our innovation model. For example, I mean, I've mentioned this before, nobody in this country really knows how most of those innovations come about. What makes Steve Jobs and others decide to invent a computer in their garage, or people like Zuckerman decide to pursue a different way of social media. People without a lot of means who later become some of the wealthiest people in the world. But that innovation model, which fosters free ideas, free exchange, free pursuit of scientific technology, a capitalist model that rewards those with the best technologies and investments. For example, in this country, we've had a number of inventors since the time of Edison who talked about the role of the marketplace in deciding the best technologies and the best approaches. And so that innovation model will, quite frankly, beat China's innovation model 10 times out of 10 times. I really have tremendous confidence in it. And the best proof I can give you that China's leaders recognize that is that they are determined to steal from it. They know they can't win a competition head on head. They know they can't compete with that kind of entrepreneurship and innovation, which is why the state has to exercise that level of control. But I will say, in terms of what are China's ambitions, it's backed also by a growing military presence. And the One Belt, One Road has an economic component, as Alan described. But if you look at where the concentrations of Chinese investment are, you'd find a very heavy correlation between the strategic high ground, either in strategic geographic locations or in strategic technology sectors, what we would call the high ground, things like telecommunications and IT, because of the impact that it plays on society. China wants to influence those things and is willing to use state enterprises and its security sectors aiding state companies or permeating them to accomplish those aims. So that is something we've got to be very concerned about. In terms of the One Belt, One Road initiative, President Xi has talked about there needs to be a security dimension to the One Belt, One Road. So you're starting to see China develop overseas military bases, overseas intelligence collection locations. And this is one of the areas that's a challenge to sovereignty. You know, as an example, when then Secretary of Defense Mattis visited Argentina, China has established a series of satellite control stations in various countries. In the beginning, the Argentines talked about this was something that they could access. They knew what was going on in that part of Argentina. But their main questioning of the Secretary of Defense when he visited was, can you tell us what's going on in that part of Argentina? Because China no longer gives us access to that location. China has taken over that portion, and we are not in a position to assert our sovereignty. So as the then Secretary of Defense would describe, there are many ways to lose your sovereignty, and this is one of them. This is not a permissive model. This is one that's an authoritarian model. And it's backed, again, by a state organization and substantially increased spending. If I was here a few years ago, I would have talked about China's military spending being somewhere on the order of 20 billion in their official statistics. But just in the last few years, we've seen a 750% growth in China's defense spending. over a 10-year period. That's real money, approaching $200 billion per year for the state publicized budget, when we know that the real budget is many times larger than that. And that money is going towards developing new advanced capabilities to try to compete militarily. Again, to have the world's strongest military, to have positions overseas. And it may surprise you, some of the locations. If you looked along, for example, the Arctic or the high north, you'd see a very high concentration of Chinese investment. For instance, I visited last year in Greenland. Greenland is an area where China is eyeing port and infrastructure investments. I visited Iceland on that trip. The Icelandic authorities informed me that the largest embassy in Iceland was the Chinese embassy. I said, gee, what are they doing here? They said, well, they approached us about being part of the One Belt, One Road initiative, but we chose not to join in Iceland. But they say they're here promoting cultural ties as part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. And the historic ties between the Icelandic people and their colleagues in China are their focus. I see. Just a hunch that might not be where Marco Polo and the Silk Road transited. Not that I have the same level of historical expertise, but methinks there might be something more there at play. And so, but I don't think this is unusual. If you went to Djibouti, why has China established their first overseas base there? Again, the long ties between the Djiboutin people and the Chinese counterparts, I'm sure, is part of the explanation. But this is part of China expanding its global reach into areas that may surprise you. And we have to be serious about protecting this international rules-based order, about protecting free trade, about protecting the free movement of ideas and the role of the individual in society. And I'm sure my colleagues will talk more about some of the surveillance technology and the approaches that China's applying domestically, which are things we haven't seen in quite some time, but it's an attempt to recreate those authoritarian societies we saw in the past.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Rood. I think this was an excellent description of the extent of the threat. And since you mentioned surveillance, we were talking during the break about the technological solutions for smart cities and smart defense and smart policing. And I saw a map recently that showed the use of Chinese technology, and it's very red, the world map. And that's something that I think should concern all of us. But going back to the description of the threat, Minister Rinkēvičs, is this assessment shared by European allies? How would you assess the solidity or the coherence of the understanding at a EU level and of perhaps looking at the solutions?
Well, actually, I think that we are experiencing some kind of transformation in the European thinking on risks and threats. But as always, it comes quite slow. I still remember how we were approaching disinformation campaign 5 years ago when most of European colleagues said that this is about media freedom and only now we are speaking about information warfare. I think the same happens now also in the discussion how much we should address economic and trade component with China and how much worried we need to be about the risks that are raising both when it comes to assertive China from geopolitical point of view, but also about information technologies. From my own perspective, well, that was great to hear about some experience in Iceland, but from the Baltic perspective, look, a couple of years ago we had the first, and it would be very difficult for the Latvian foreign minister not to mention Russia in any conversation. But now the time comes when I can do it. A couple of years ago we had joint Russian-Chinese naval exercises in the Baltic Sea, followed by courtesy visits of China Navy in some of the Baltic ports, but still that was the first time ever that such kind of exercise took place. We just had a good meeting in Iceland within the Nordic-Baltic foreign ministers framework where we discussed Arctic and also the common approaches in Arctic, where the factor of 3 big players apart from those countries that are in Arctic which is EU, China, and Russia was discussed extensively. I think this is another, how to say, geographic place where we need to be very, very attentive and also cautious when it comes to security implications. But again, I think we are going to have continuous debate within EU, but also in a wider framework, what comes first? Trade and economy, or security and geopolitics? The same debate we are from time to time having about Russia, and things are getting a bit complicated because if you look at the discussion at the EU level, climate change, rules-based trade is something that we find a lot of common with China. Security, issues that are related with IT and, let's say, tackling of growing influence of many of those players, that's where we find more common with the United States. And when you have 28, soon to be 27 EU member states, then reaching that consensus is not easy. My final point that I want to leave about this kind of understanding is that if you have listened carefully what one of leaders of one of the biggest EU members have said recently when he was addressing Russia issue, and he was speaking about the need to create common security space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, was also a notion that we need to be careful not to drag Russia into more relationship with China. Well, frankly, I dispute that argument because I believe there is huge competition that we will see also between those two powers, Russia and China, soon enough. But you see that also this kind of thinking, how we are going to approach, let's say, Russia problem from European point of view, is now more linked to China than ever before in our discussions. That is something that is developing. That is something that the small nation in the EU, with its own security challenges like Latvia, is now watching carefully, and we are also searching those answers not only at the European level, but also at national level. How to balance the economic issues with security issues and how to find the appropriate equilibrium. And this is not going to be an easy case.
They do seem to be more interrelated by the day. So I think there will come a time when we won't be able to separate them anymore.
And that's why we are turning always to NATO for answer. And that's why I was saying that it would be good also to involve more discussion within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because there the dynamic is a bit different than at the EU level.
Thank you, Minister Rinkēvičs. And thank you for mentioning Russia-China coordination. And that's a topic that has been of concern for us at CEPA for a while, and we will continue to work on that. I think that's something where there's no consensus, whether there is coordination or competition, or where that is going. Professor Riley, I'll turn to you if you want to address Russia-China, because you have mentioned what happens if you accept Chinese investment. You're probably accepting Russian investment, actually. So if you want to jump on that. And then just going back to the issue of political influence and how we tackle that, and how credible it is to believe that the EU, or on a transatlantic level, we can actually develop a code of conduct or a series of regulations to deal with that. Briefly.
Briefly, okay. I'll take political influence first. I think the political influence thing, it's actually, it may be easier to deal with because at one level, in terms of political will, simply because of all of the Russian interference in Western political debate, elections, and so on. In the sense that the influence issues, and of course it's not just a cyber disinformation thing on which there are probably far too many conferences, but but the broader, you know, the working with actors within our own society, lots of false friends, etc. And because one of the difficulties, it's one of the points I also often make about sanctions, the difficulty if you look at the traditional view of sanctions is it's Iran, where the sanctions regime is more or less stable for 30 years. Nothing is stable in a relationship with Russia because you have these twin forces of the continual conflict in Ukraine and the continued Russian interference. So it acts as a kind of generator of more and more trouble and more response from the West. So I think that dynamic creates a situation, maybe focus on China and Russia, but it has also a significant effect in China. You won't create Russia-specific regulations, you will create general regulations. And I think we will get to a stage where we will have to have issues about who can own media. We get to something which is not a treason law, but is a kind of sedition law, where you actually participate in the undermining of your state with a hostile foreign power. You have regulations which deal with with foreign money and where it comes from, for not just companies or the public sector, but for think tanks, NGOs, and universities. And there'll be, I think, more than that, there'll just be a much greater awareness of how this operates. And the interesting question is whether or not it may be easier to draft those at EU level than it will be at national level in a European context. I think the Russia-China issue is an amazing issue if we turn to that, because at one level you've got this tremendously powerful Chinese economy, at least for now, and then you have got what is actually a very weak and emaciated economically Russia, with nuclear missiles, and the contested territory in the Russian Far East, contested, I think, legally, morally, economically, the interpenetration, creating a security issues for Russia as well, and at the same time, enormous dynamics for the of trade. I mean, one of the areas I know very well is the level of potential for Russian gas trade between China and Russia. All of those issues play in a number of different ways between the Russians and the Chinese, and they create points of cooperation, but also points of tremendous hostility. Where does that end up? It ends up in, you've got to say, the dynamic works in the direction of ultimately more conflict than it does in relation into more cooperation. And I can probably go into that and explain that in more detail, but I haven't got any time. So, but I think that's where you probably end up ultimately with less in terms of cooperation and more in terms of conflict. And I think part of it is to simply do with the massive disparity in power and the sense from the Russian perspective of the underlying threat, not just in terms of the kind of notional idea that they simply annex the Russian Far East, but the simple loss of control without that going that far, economically and politically, in those regions. So I think, and we could argue that the great mistake of Putin, a strategic mistake, was not to embrace the West and ram Russia into the Euro-Atlantic institutions to defend itself against China. Which is actually, when I pointed that out to senior Russian officials, I get a pause before they deny everything about what I'm saying. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes left, and I already see 2 hands there. I can't really see, but I think that's Ben Hodges, and then the gentleman on the 3rd row here to the right. And someone who just got a microphone. We'll take 3 at a time. Please identify yourselves and keep them brief. Ben?
Thanks, Corina. My question is to Undersecretary Rood about missile defense. Mr. Secretary, you've been leading the way on pushing improvement of America's integrated air and missile defense. China has indicated they have no desire to be part of any arms control agreement. The Kremlins have been bragging about their newest capabilities. What are your expectations of our allies in Europe as well as in the Pacific to contribute towards integrated air and missile defense?
Well, first of all, General Hodges, it's great to see you, what I can see of you through the lights, but we should have you on this panel given your expertise, and we missed you, sir. But let me just say in the direct response to your question, I think we do need to focus correctly on air and missile defense capabilities. When we look at areas where the NATO alliance and NATO capabilities are not at the level that we would like them to be, given the threats that we now face from unmanned aerial systems, from cruise missiles, and from ballistic missiles, we do need to focus more on that. We've been, of course, making strides in the NATO alliance, and NATO has an organized effort in this regard. But more is certainly required, because when you really do a stress test, as people like you did when you were in uniform, and look at these in exercises, while we can pat ourselves on the back and be proud of the advancement NATO has made, the threat that we face has developed faster. And so as much progress as you've made, if you're not staying equal to or making greater progress than that threat picture, it's a serious problem. And there are certain capabilities that NATO states have that other nations don't, but that's why we're seeing an asymmetric investment in things like swarming UAS technology, like unmanned aerial systems that really fly more like the cruise missiles we saw during the Blitz on London in World War II. That really are a missile, as well as shorter range missiles, and the advancement of this position, navigation, and timing that we all have on our cell phones, we all have in our cars, and things of that nature. Now that is applied more readily to the accuracy needed for ballistic missiles, for cruise missiles, for UAS capabilities, that's changing that technology, that's changing the situation we face. And clever adversaries like the Russians are applying that in new ways. That's, if we went to school on what the Russians applied in a place like Ukraine, I think that would be a real challenge for NATO to deal with on the battlefield. And so that's what we're talking about within the NATO alliance. We need to do certainly much better. And as part of our investment priorities, we have to shift as an alliance where we're putting our level of effort, if you will, to put a little more emphasis in that area.
Thank you. Okay, let's go back. We'll take three at a time, sir. Yes, please.
Can you hear?
Yes.
It helps when you're in possession of the microphone. My question concerns trade.
Could you please identify yourself?
Oh, Ken Bombera, and I'm with Friends of Slovakia.
Great.
My question concerns trade and sort of the rules-based order. And if you recall, back in the 2016 election, if there was one thing that united the two major candidates and the two major parties, was opposition to the Transatlantic Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. And the premise of the TPP, one of the premises, was to, kind of unite the Pacific region as a counter to China through the rule-based order and trade and so forth. So, of course, the U.S. pulled out of that. But my question is, well, from your perspective, particularly Mr. Rood and Mr. Riley, what do you think, what was so bad about the TPP? And is that something that we should reconsider, perhaps going forward, insofar as it was meant to be a counter to China and to isolate China, and bring more countries into the rule-based order? So I'd appreciate your comments.
Excellent, thank you. And we had a gentleman over there and a gentleman right in front. Yes.
Thank you. Marek Świetliński, Polityka Insight. My question will be about Chinese military technology. I think it was last week that we saw the news about Chinese unmanned aerial vehicles being acquired by the country of Serbia. I would like to ask your assessment of the risks related to proliferation, or I should say infiltration, of Chinese military technology into what we think is the Western world, or maybe of the entire Chinese technology to the Western military. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you could pass it in front. Oh, I think it was the gentleman in front of you. Sorry.
Thank you. David Král, Director of the Policy Planning Staff in the Czech Foreign Ministry. Very fascinating debate. Actually, a very short reaction to Alan's statement about the Belt and Road Initiative and the Silk Road collapse. I find that very interesting, but in fact, I think that it presupposes one thing, and that is the respect for the freedom of navigation, right? And respect for the freedom of high seas. And if I look at the Chinese activities, especially in the South China Sea, which has de facto been militarized by China already by taking control over Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands, and with the exception of Scarborough Rocks, I think China will de facto have a control of the South China Sea. Can we actually trust the fact that their ambition will not go even farther, and they will not like to take control of the high seas in other areas which are crucial for global economy, right? And one question maybe to the other panelists as well. It has not been mentioned, I think, in what ways we actually see China as a competitor to the West in a way of promoting, let's say, a different development model. Do you think that actually promotion of this development model can bring us on a collision course in some third countries, particularly in Africa? So I'll be very glad to have your comments on that. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. If we could get some brief responses, hopefully we can get some more questions. So we have the TPP question, the military technology, and the control of high seas, as well as China as a competitor. Undersecretary Rood, do you want to start first?
Sure. Which one would you like me to start with?
Your pick.
Okay. Well, maybe the last one on the freedom of the navigation in the high seas is one that's probably the closest to the Defense Department's role in the world. We are very concerned about that for the reasons you talked about. If you look at a map and China's so-called 9-dash line, which it draws, it's essentially carving out the Pacific as an area that it wants to assert its sovereignty over and say others require China's permission to transit that area. Even just the way that China goes about implementing that to say, it'll be free so long as you notify us in advance and obtain our permission gives you a sense of their mindset around that. Now, it's fair to say we don't recognize in the United States those boundaries, and we fly, sail, and navigate regularly through those areas. We do not request permission in order to do that. We're trying to uphold through our actions and our words the international rules-based system that allows for freedom of navigation. We're also trying to explain to our Chinese colleagues that this is actually in their interest as well, and that as China grows to be a larger and larger economy, certainly this kind of predictability and underpinning is something that is in everyone's interest. As I say, we want to take the approach of competing. We want to take the approach of taking China's threat very seriously, but we engage directly with the Chinese. And one of the things that we emphasize to them in this conversation about what are our strategic intentions is that our view in the United States is we don't see China as someone that we are destined to be an adversary. There's no proverb or something that has been written with that language. And despite the narrative the Chinese Communist Party tells of the experience of the last 100 years, in fact, it's poppycock. There were times in our history where we were collaborators. For example, in World War II, our military fought in China against a common foe. There are many instances where we have had areas of collaboration. But I will say on that area, we have to all stand tall and be firm in saying that we can't respect those sorts of things because they can be applied elsewhere. And even in the formal areas where China has acceded to things like the Convention on the Law of the Sea, when other states have gone through the formal rulings, of course, those mechanisms have ruled against China's claims to sovereignty over those areas. It's economically driven, and it's much more of a mercantilist approach, or something approaching, the best I can say is sort of the Ming Dynasty, a time when all roads led to China. You notice the terminology used for the one belt, one road. It's one belt and one road that China, in their view, would own and charge others for the fee of utilizing, as opposed to our concept, which is many roads, many belts, a mesh of things that interrelate our different societies and bring us together. And so I will say that that has been our approach, You're seeing through statistics a growth in the number of freedom of navigation operations we conduct in the Pacific and elsewhere to just try to reaffirm that we're not going to respect that kind of arbitrary line. And I think, you know, one of the things that someone else mentioned was how do we see China as a competitor to the West as a development model. There, I think, again, where the state intervenes to skew markets to affect them, such as in the telecommunications area, that's where we have to have investment screening, where we have to have procedures to address that. But I see some growth in that. For instance, in the EU, I noticed there is a World Trade Organization complaint against China that the EU has filed for violations of intellectual property. The European Chamber of Commerce, when they poll their member states, the companies, over 20% of them say today they feel coerced into giving up their intellectual property to do business in China. And the Justice Department in this country, for example, or Justice Departments in a variety of other nations has filed claims, and there are, you know, there's strong evidence of China violating those rules. There we have to enforce our rules and make this an issue between states, between our organizations, or we're going to regret the results if we don't take it very, very seriously. And the last thing I'd end on is the role of the individual. If you haven't put into your browser things like the China's social credit score, or the attempts of the Chinese state to monitor its citizens to an extent that George Orwell would be proud of in 1984, you really ought to look at that. And that's being applied at scale in places like Xinjiang. Over 1.5 million people being subjected to this type of surveillance, internment, and other activities. It's not a theoretical application of this principle. And so we should all, you know, take that very seriously.
Thank you very much. Minister, I know you have to leave, but if you want to take any of the questions or offer a capstone.
Just a very quick one before I leave. That's not out of disagreement with panelists, but I have to catch the train to New York. Just on the last question about some areas where we are competing, like Africa or Western Balkans, I think that the European Commission has put it really right when it described very recently China as cooperation partner, competitor, and systemic rival at the same time. That's exactly what China is. However, I would stop whining about, let's say, China and its growing influence in Africa or in Western Balkans. I would put the question what the EU can do more. And our problem with Western Balkans, for instance, is the enlargement process. We have been kind of unable to agree on the further steps of enlargement, and we do not have anything to offer to those countries except promises. We are going to return again in October in General Affairs Council about Albania and North Macedonia. We have to start accession talks with them, but because of some internal problems in some of EU member states, we are unable to do it. So if we are not able to provide clear perspective for Western Balkans, then let's stop whining about some other countries that are taking actually the vacuum we are creating. And another thing is about Africa. That's again, what we can offer and how we can best use those resources that we are actually putting a lot there to provide some competitive model, which is a bit different from the Chinese offer. Well, they are not asking for better governance, for fight against corruption, for rule of law. Those are things they are not really caring about. But still, in the long run, I think that this is more beneficial for those countries that are actually using our way of model. So this is not a very easy thing, but I think this is not the right question about China or Russia or somebody else, but it's actually what we can do more and what we do more efficiently in this respect. So I'll stop here, and I understand I will have to move in about a couple of minutes out
Thank
of
you,
the room.
Mr. Minister. We are going to finish this panel in a couple of minutes too, but I want to give Alan a chance to answer the question.
I mean, what I think you would say is that, and this is echoing what the Minister said to some degree, but one of the core elements of this is to recognize, yes, okay, for example, the Chinese have an enormous influence on the telecommunication systems across Africa. But the problem is that comes with it at a huge price of Chinese influence, Chinese surveillance and so on, which ultimately, as the societies recognize what it is a problem. and actually a more privacy, rule of law based technology systems in the West become more attractive. And actually we simply use our own societal advantages in a commercial context to be able to move against and compete with effectively and oust that Chinese influence. And again, I think the minister's right about the, do we need more substantial investment funds, infrastructure funds, done on good terms, in terms of the rule of law, whatever, but are actually quite attractive and better for you in the long run. And we work with those states who work with us on those, benefit and are seen to benefit, and we pull more towards us. In the Western Balkans, one of my ideas for this is that it is difficult. There are a whole series of political reasons why the Western Balkans are difficult to get moving. But do we need, perhaps, in the meantime, more European Investment Bank funding to assist in the region? Should we take the energy community and upgrade it into a kind of regional EEA and get at least the EU single market rules in place if we can't immediately get them in as members? I mean, I think there are things we can do which would be able to push things forward, make a series of public and commercial attractive offers which compete with the Chinese, and we can both do that both with the EU and the US, and ideally together.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, and I know the minister has to run, so we won't keep this any longer. It's clear that we've only just begun answering some of the questions when it comes to strategic competition with China. Please stick around. Some of these issues will resurface in the following panels. And thank you very much for joining the conversation, and please join me in thanking our panelists.